right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner Podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner Podcast. I am back here with Jay Dyer, who is a comedian and author of 2 books. He is the host of his own show, Hollywood Decoded. He also wrote 2 books called Esoteric Hollywood, and he hosts the 4th hour of Alex Jones' show. Awesome work. Thank you for coming back. I'm super excited to dive into this. I was just telling you how I feel like very few people have heard of Tavistock. So I really wanted to do kind of a deep dive on it. And I always say that I feel like, I like going down rabbit holes, but to me, Tavistock is not a rabbit hole. It's like a black hole. I need more than a bag of carrots for it, So I would love if you probably know way more than I do. I feel like I barely scratched the surface of it. Maybe we could start with just the history of, starting from the Wellington House and and then how did the Wellington House become Tavistock Clinic to Tavistock Institute? Yeah, and why?
Right. Well, so my recollection, I haven't looked at this in a while, but is that Tavistock was a product of the wartime studies of shell shock. So you had the idea that when these guys were coming home from originally World War One, they had this phenomenon that they didn't know what it was, and so it ended up becoming called shell shock. And then through a Rockefeller grant, this eventually became the creation of the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. So they were studying interpersonal social dynamics, and it was tied into a bunch of other kind of elite institutions beyond Rockefeller: Rand Corporation, MIT, Palo Alto Institute for Social Research, Wharton School of Business, London School of Economics, Hudson Institute, Esalen Institute, which is a big CIA, basically the brainchild of the New Age movement out in Big Sur. Office of Naval Research. They have a branch in New York
too, upstate New York as well. Yeah.
And all of these were connected to people from Tavistock and the Tavistock Institute in the UK, and they basically wanted to create a new way for man to see his own relationship to one another and his own relationship to the world. And so they were big early on promoters of the idea of austerity, ZPG, zero population growth, the idea that man's attitude of who he was needed to be altered into a guilt complex idea, that he was taking up too much resources. This kind of all of that actually comes out of studies that Tavistock did. And even members of Tavistock like Kurt Lewin would be seminal figures in the MK Ultra program. Kurt Lewin was actually one of the early founders of the MK Ultra projects. And so it's a very close parallel to the US version of MK Ultra and Tavistock studies into social engineering. So all of these things are connected in varying degrees to Tavistock, but it's a lot of the trends that we see: veganism, feminism. They may not have originated at Tavistock, but Tavistock will study how to take those things and popularize them, make them trendy. They pioneered things like groupthink. They studied things through the characters like Rees and Lewins of how to have social breakdown. So when you study how social dynamics works, you can also figure out how it doesn't work, right? So you learn how to break things down. And so they really got deep into psychological operations, psychological warfare, the promotion of scientism, the promotion of feminism. They even got to where they were studying how to engineer social breakdown and the promotion of mania. So literally people having schizophrenic mania episodes And really what they wanted to do was create a controlled technocratic type society, as I said, based around that guilt complex that humans are bad, humans are taking up too much space, too much carbon. And that's exactly what we see today. In other words, is the modern world is birthed out of things like the Rand Corporation and Tavistock.
Right. Yeah, I think that I was reading that Lewin wrote a paper on like creating the decline of meat consumption.
Yes.
And like,
correct.
yeah, and the Rand. So I live in Santa Monica. Rand is like down the block from me, and their address is 1776. I know. It's very right. I find it very odd. Yeah. So So I've heard Tavistock talked about as being like the mother of all think tanks. Yeah. So, but they seem very connected to all the other think tanks and possibly influence them as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's difficult to say which one is the head of them all. I mean, they kind of have their own foci, and things that they specialize in. I mean, we've seen a lot of controversy in the past few years in regard to Tavistock in terms of the promotion of transitioning, gender transitions. So that's been in the news a lot in the last 2 years over controversies at the Tavistock Institute and their studies into how to basically promote that. So that's
their Tavistock relationship branch, right? They have like they have lots of branches. It's a kind of like that was the other thing I thought was really interesting. So all these agencies that are so connected, like you were just saying. So the CFR started in 1921. The Tavistock Clinic before the Tavistock was also 1921. The Institute for Social Research. So it's interesting that they were all same time.
And a lot of these tied in directly to MK Ultra. So that's a key point to know.
Can you talk a little bit about how and explain to? I think a lot of people have heard of MK Ultra, but might not be that familiar with exactly.
Well, I think what you just mentioned, that institute. So a lot of these things are covers for other things. So, for example, the Human Ecology Fund was a cover for some of the MK Ultra projects, the mind control projects. They would basically create all kinds of different institute for this, research study program for this. The Fulbright Scholarship, for example, was largely given to people who were in MK Ultra. So that famous scholarship is another cover for those kinds of things. Dolphin Research Center down when they were doing the dolphin studies with John C. Lilly, that was a cover for MK Ultra. So something like Tavistock was intimately connected. It was basically the UK version of MK Ultra, and you even had as I said, somebody like Kurt Lewin, who was also working in the MK Ultra projects. People from Tavistock that you've probably heard of would be people like Sigmund Freud, people like Carl Jung. I mean, some of the most famous psychoanalysts and
Edward Bernays was a nephew of Freud.
Right. Yeah. They were all connected to Tavistock, and if you try to buy Tavistock books, they're really expensive. Like
I tried to buy, I found it, but without buying. But Dr. John Coleman's, and their title is so ominous: shaping the decline of the moral, political, sociocultural decline, everything decline of Great Britain and the United States. But it was $4,800 on Amazon.
Well, Daniel Estlin has a good book on Tavistock.
Yes, I have that one as well.
From my publisher, that's a good one. And
awesome.
He goes into just kind of the overview, the basic histories of it, and a lot of it's, as I said, is engineering people's thought processes, right? Controlling how they think, how they view themselves. And so it's like getting people to accept, how do we condition people to accept becoming fat, right? Fat acceptance. How do we accept people to, how do we move them out of an economy based around production to a service-based economy? And then how do we move people into a notion of infantilism where the nanny state basically runs your life? All of those things are literally studied by, in fact, one of the things that they pioneered was group leaderships, team leaders. So if you've ever been in a corporate setting where they were setting up, oh, this is your corporate team leader, we're gonna, all this stupid corporate thing, cheerleading things, that's all out of Tavistock.
They called it group therapies. Yeah.
Another thing that they pioneered was the idea of employee of the month. That's a Tavistock thing. And
really,
so all these like corporate tricks and strategies to get people to work harder, and because it's all about control and how do you get people to do what you want.
And so they kind of shaped the rise of the corporatocracy from the psychological tactics. Yeah.
And so they're intimately tied into the notion of creating consensus reality is another thing they pioneered. They pioneered selling the idea of zero growth in different sectors in terms of austerity, including carbon emissions, control. All of those things come out of Tavistock, and we can see why that is, because MK Ultra is a directly Rockefeller funded thing. Rockefeller's fund and create the CFR, the Rockefeller's fund and create United Nations. Rockefellers are intimately tied to funding MK Ultra projects and research.
Right.
And so that's where, even people like B.F. Skinner, right, were funded by the Rockefellers. So,
and I thought that part was interesting because the Club of Rome did the limits of growth paper. What was it, back in the 70s? Right.
Correct.
So yeah, so I feel like they must be connected as well, the Club of Rome and Tavistock.
I'm sure you could find people that would be attending both of those. I don't recall off the top of my head. Other than like the Rockefellers being tied in up in both of those.
They seem to be a common thread through much of it. Yeah.
Well, Maurice Strong is an example of somebody who was involved in creating New Age movements in Canada.
Yeah.
And he was kind of the head guy at Club of Rome. So there's a direct connection between United Nations, New Age movements, depopulation, and Club of Rome. So I think Maurice Strong had a lot of weird connections, but
yeah.
The Tavistock research was used. For example, there was an interesting chapter in his book about how to get rid of and infiltrate unions. So workers' unions, which, a lot of people probably think, oh, that's just a bunch of communists. Actually, they may have been, but they were literally, the Rockefellers took over all unions in the world. And they used subterfuge and Tavistock tactics to do that. And there's a really fascinating chapter in Esselman's book on that.
What was I going to say?
Well, they took them over to steer them towards globalist goals, is the point.
Which seemed the Tavistock Institute seems to be very much aligned with, I guess makes sense with their funding sources, but with all of the globalist goals. And but one of the things I thought was interesting.
Oh, by the way, I'm sorry.
No.
You asked about, he does cover on page 55, connections to CIA. So we were talking about how would that connect to MK Ultra.
Yeah.
Most major universities were entirely substantially branches of the CIA. At the University of Michigan, we have the most notorious example of the Institute for Social Research, which called its work a telescope on society. ISR are notorious disciples of John Rees from Tavistock. And then there was Harvard's Russian Institute, like Columbia's, but Harvard's psychology department is a covert operation run by the CIA, using Reesian psychopathy from B.F. Skinner, a psychologist who asserted that men have no minds. MIT was also a flourishing nest of CIA activity. University of Pennsylvania, Wharton School was home to Eric Trist, the Rockefeller-sponsored Russian Reesian guy who worked on projects at Cornell, Berkeley, Stanford, all of which were CIA operations. So all of the basically, and I just did a whole study last night on stuff relating to MK Ultra I didn't know about. Some new stuff to me. There's a good essay that I found online that's By John Marks, who wrote the book Manchurian Candidate, The History of the CIA and MK Ultra. Well, he has another essay that he wrote about Dr. Gettinger, who created personality tests. And I think Tavistock has done stuff to do with personality tests too. But John Gettinger was the CIA's personality assessment.
Like the MIPP, like that, those, yeah.
Yeah. Like I don't remember.
I conducted one of those in high school for my research. I'm very familiar with that particular one, but.
Okay, yeah. So a bunch of these doctors that I had, some of them I heard of, some of I'd never heard of, like Kurt Lewin I knew of. But a lot of these guys were running these types of Tavistock MK Ultra style projects at universities all over. So in fact, a huge series of operations that were part of MK Ultra were done, for example, in Australia. I didn't even know this. I've been reading about MK Ultra for a long time. I just last night learned about all of these operations that were done in Australia, and it was a bunch of MK Ultra doctors I'd never heard of. Dr. John Sutcliffe, William Sargant, Robert Heath, Dr. Hans Eysenck, who I had heard of, Alfred G. Hammer, the Human Ecology Fund had a front in Australia. Leonard Huxley, there's actually another Huxley brother that was involved in MK Ultra operations in Australia. Wow. Dr. Wendy Thorne, Dr. Cecil Gibb, Gregory Basin, Sir Gustav Nossal, who's on the Gates Foundation board, was connected to MK Ultra operations in Australia. So all kinds of crazy stuff that is coming to the fore that I just recently learned about. But anyway, so we see a pattern there of the types of things that that Tavistock people are doing with the Institute for Social Research come up like a kind of a model or a pattern in all these other places. And so, yeah, I think RAND is another one of those things. I've done a talk, if you're not aware or listeners aren't aware, on the history of the RAND Corporation from Alex Abea. So he kind of wrote the authorized history of RAND, but it's still, it's pretty revelatory, even though it's an authorized history. He really tells the whole story of RAND Corporation and basically says that they've created the America of the 20th century. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The RAND history is quite fascinating. Because of you talked about in the last time we talked, you talked about Annie Jacobson's book on DARPA. So right. I've read that, which is also really fascinating. A lot of it talks about RAND.
Yeah, and it ties in well with the Alex Abea book, because a lot of the people right at RAND are some of the same people working at DARPA.
Right.
John von Neumann, people like that who were sort of computer pioneers.
And when you're talking about in Eslin's book, I thought it was really interesting that he talked about a lot of the people in the CIA and a lot of these members of the different, councils that are connected have to go through tactics and, for lack of a better way of putting it, brainwashing strategies before they can be appointed. That was a part of Eslin's book that I thought was really interesting, that he was saying like essentially they have to be brainwashed by Tavistock strategies.
Yeah, and this is something that I think we're seeing a pattern of too, with people who kind of have to be vetted before they rise in the power structure. A lot of people are starting to notice that it seems like there's a vetting process, that you don't you don't climb up in the power structure. And we've seen this a lot in Hollywood, where it appears that a lot of the pop stars kind of have to do certain degrading things before they can, rise up. And, if you know the whole story with all the Epstein stuff and how that was being run, then we start to realize that, it seems to require blackmail basically to get higher and higher in the structure. And there is a lot of, corporate brainwashing. In fact, if you watch Mad Men, then, at the end of the show, it ends with, the main character, leaving the ad world to go basically to Esalen. Mm-hmm. And that's around the time when they started importing into the corporate world all of these new agey techniques, right? They would even have new age corporate retreats where they would try to brainwash corporate people. There's one of the global elite books that I do is Marilyn Ferguson's book, Aquarian Conspiracy. And
I have not read that, but that's on my list for sure. Please tell.
She talks about this very thing about taking, and I think she was connected to Esalen. I'm going from memory here, but she was basically saying that, yeah, we got to take these kind of new age principles and take the CEOs and kind of like brainwash them into accepting these new age principles, so that when they come out of this training, they'll run their corporations, you know, in a new world order appropriate way. And I mean, Klaus Schwab's book, you know, Fourth Industrial Revolution, basically says that. He says we want corporate leaders of the future who will accept the new covenant of the new world economic religion, basically, which is stakeholder capitalism, all this kind of stuff that he's invented, terms wise.
Can you clarify that a bit? I think it's really interesting, just the wording. They don't say shareholder, they say stakeholder. And it's all throughout the World Economic Forum's website. They keep talking about this.
So this is a new way to try to recast the corporations as having a duty to every, you know, bizarre minority. So if you're a, you know, if you're a hermaphrodite, Inuit, lesbian, you have a say-so in the company, right? So, and you can't be unfair by not representing every group, but really all that is just a way to try to socially engineer through guilt complex. Remember, Tavistock pioneered especially a lot of that notion of guilt complex.
Yeah.
That if you don't go along with the groupthink, you're bad, you're guilty, you're causing problems, you're hurting the earth, right? That's all Tavistock invented stuff, all this guilt complex. So yeah, so that's what they try to do is guilt you into things that you shouldn't even feel guilty about. But it's very powerful when you combine it with groupthink, because people just kind of, they don't want to be seen as out of, you know, accord with the group.
Right, because we're social creatures, and they really they harness that to weaponize it, so that, yeah. I also, the other one that, and we touched a little bit on it the last time, about how the Frankfurt School and Tavistock, and it seems like there's definitely offshoots from both. They've worked in tandem with each other. It sounds like one of them seems to be more of, Tavistock is a little bit more of like a top-down approach, while the Frankfurt School seems to be a little bit more of a bottom-up approach to subversion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So the Frankfurt School were critical theory Marxists. So they differed from the kind of the Stalinist Eastern Bloc Marxists. And they have a whole kind of lineage and a bunch of different disputes amongst themselves. But so this would be people like Horkheimer, Adorno, Marcuse, and somebody directly related to Tavistock is social justice warrior pioneer Herbert Marcuse. And so he kind of was the brains behind things like student movements in the 60s, and like doing things like wearing long hair and sandals, free love communes, all this kind of stuff was something that was connected to Tavistock, the budding sort of hippie movement, you could say. I'm not saying that Tavistock completely invented it or that Frankfurt School invented it, but they really promoted and thought that these things could be good ways to re-engineer society. And that's why you get people like Tim Leary saying that if you want to thank anybody for the 60s countercultural revolution, you could thank the CIA. And then there was a great article in Foreign Affairs pretty recently, which was detailing how the Frankfurt School, the OSS brought the Frankfurt School people over to America to teach them how to, quote, fight Nazis. But all it was teaching them how to do culture creation, culture engineering. And so, I mean, I actually, one of my grad professors was a Frankfurt School trained professor, so I know a lot about the Frankfurt School, and so yeah, they were very amenable to the West, especially during the Cold War. So yeah, so that's they had a plan to bring down the existing Western civilization. One of the things that they put out was The Authoritarian Complex, which is a book about how if you have a family, that's fascism, right? Because the father is a fascist figure. So yeah, all of these guys were intimately connected in, you know, all of these basically, they're all these things are doing the same stuff, right? Erich Fromm, Adorno, they all talked about the promotion of degenerate sex as a way to take down society, and that's where that gets into the kind of the destruction of the authoritarian personality, aka just the family. And so
sorry, take down the family. Yeah, so you're talking about the OSS, and I had recently learned that I thought this was really interesting. Apparently Jung worked for the OSS and was kind of like a spy on the Nazi regime, and but really was working for the OSS. But I think now in hindsight, it seems at the time I thought that alone was really fascinating, but it seems like there's a lot of this so the Tavistock was kind of behind some of the OSS under the guise of things that seemed like things we would support, but not necessarily helping the American people.
Well, I mean, remember that the OSS was created in tandem with the Rockefellers and British intelligence to move America into being another form of the British Empire, right? I mean, if you listen to the show that we did with Alex the other day, that was me getting into Quigley's.
It was excellent, by the way. Yeah, and I was really impressed with how quickly you summed that up. That's really dense.
Thanks, yeah. Well, and Quigley says there that the plan of Cecil Rhodes and those people was to bring America back under the sway of the British Empire. They didn't exactly get it under a British imperial model, but it doesn't matter because it's the same people that run the Pax Americana that eventually emerged out of the two world wars. So the OSS is really kind of the private intelligence network of the Rockefeller families and the globalists. That's really the way to see it. And so that's what explains things like why Bill Donovan, the so-called founder of the OSS, would go and train Mao's army. So Mao's guerrillas, this is declassified on the CIA website. Mao's guerrillas were all trained by Bill Donovan, the founder of the OSS. That explains why Mao was a Yali, or Yale in China. So he was actually working for the interest of Skull and Bones to really just destroy the existing Chinese culture and replace it with a Maoist model, which they knew would be more easily integrated into the globalist model. And that's why now people like Klaus Schwab, Henry Kissinger, they've for many, many years, Richard Haas, the CFR, they've said China is the model, right? China is the future model of the global world order. And it has to do with this very point that the OSS, the CIA, set that up as a technocratic kind of control grid. And that's why the first bank in communist China was Chase Manhattan. So David Rockefeller flew over in the 60s or 70s before Nixon did, by the way, and had basically arranged that his bank would be the bank in China. And that's why he wrote those editorials in 1979 from a China traveler to the New York Times saying how great Maoism was. So, here you have the highest, most recognized American capitalist saying how much he loves Maoism and the regime that Mao put into power. And nobody at that time, knew that there was actually the OSS that put them into power. So the idea is playing a bigger game than the dialectical conflict of the Cold War. Certainly a lot of people in the Cold War thought, they were actually fighting people in communist Soviet countries. I'm not trying to detract from that. I had family members that were involved in the Cold War. So, but at a higher level, there's a longer game that's being played, which is to integrate all the countries into a global technocratic order. And even back in the 50s and 60s, they were talking about at CFR meetings, the third way, which was just blending the East and the West into a new global order. So this has been, again, a plan for a long, long time.
They play the long game. They do it very well.
Mm-hmm.
They do it very well. Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I think that's interesting. The history of Tavistock, a lot of people. So I have read Coleman's book, and I think it's interesting to, the juxtaposition of Esselins versus Coleman. Have you read Coleman's book or no?
I read it many, many years ago. I'm not saying that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones weren't connected to Tavistock. I think there is an MK Ultra association. I've just never been able to nail down for sure. But that's not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that
we haven't seen the direct link per se. Yeah. But I think what I think is interesting about the two is Coleman goes much more. I see him as more of like he looks at the links between, everything, and kind of the big global view of Tavistock's influence. And Estlin talks much more about the actual psyops and psychological warfare tactics that are involved. Right. But both of them do kind of postulate that the inception had a lot to do with fomenting the wars and, creating the opinion and brainwashing, or opinion, the social engineering, I guess is the way to word it, necessary for the wars to even happen.
Yeah, they pioneered the idea of, what does he say? Changing the population's attitudes towards television versus reading. So they got people hypnotized and addicted to the TV. They helped promote the idea of mass culture itself. They promoted the idea, which is also a Rand Corporation idea too, that you could live feed, do TV presentations of wars. So a live stream, right, of like the Gulf War, or even I think Vietnam was actually the first live television transmitted war. That was actually a Tavistock idea. What else does he? I'm trying to think of the other things he mentions. Crowd psychology, Gustave Le Bon. That was a Tavistock thing. What else does he say? I mentioned groupthink. The study of the ego and creating an infantile state. So arrested development and infantilism, which we see rampant, obviously, amongst men and males today. That's a Tavistock idea. They came up with basically everything terrible, right? They came up with. It seems
that way.
Using TV to turn off people's beta wave state to put them in an alpha wave. So for those that don't know, the alpha wave is the lower state when it comes to brain waves. So the brutalization of the public, it's not mentioned in the Tavistock book, but some people have called this the theater of brutality. That's a Tavistock idea. According to Tristan Emery, television could, he quotes, make people become adaptive to whatever is their immediate environment. So they could actually make animals, quote, or humans more animal-like, according to Trist and Emery, two of these Tavistock guys. Tavistock sold the idea of the nanny state, Big Brother. That's part of the infantilism. Another figure that's kind of overlooked that I mean to get to is, I think he's mentioned here. Well, it just mentions their Science Policy Research Institute at their Sussex facility that pioneered the idea of future shocks, defined as physical and psychological distresses that arise from excessive loads on decision-making mechanisms. So we see this in things like overflow of information, the way the internet kind of floods people with info such that they become destabilized and they don't even have a paradigm or way to judge what's true and what's false. And we've especially seen that in 2020, where this overload of infinite news sites, infinite ways to question the questioning of the questioning. That's actually part of the psychological warfare too, literally to destabilize people so that they are put into a catatonic state from what they call the future shock. One of the global elites, Alvin Toffler, wrote a whole book called Future Shock. Yep. One of the things he says in Future Shock is that in the future, we'll come up with a way to combine punk culture, anarcho culture, and veganism. So the idea of the Extinction Rebellion stuff, the idea of the vegan animal rights, all of that is engineered also by a Tavistock.
It's a bit overwhelming. That's why I say I feel like it's a dark hole. It's a black hole, not a rabbit hole. So Future Shock seems like it's kind of based off of Lewin's shell shock, which is literally this idea.
That's the thing, right? So what did they really begin with at Tavistock studying was shell shock. So you could see why they would be experts at the idea of trauma-based mind control, and the idea of what causes people to dissociate. Now, there's kind of different degrees of that dissociation, where you've got people with full-on MPD DID, where one personality doesn't know what the others are doing or up to, or they don't remember. But there's more mild versions of that, which is more useful perhaps for mass media in terms of social engineering and dissociative states through things like broadcasting wars, right? I mean, mass terror events. People have even looked into the Manson studies, the promotion of the serial killers. If you read Dave McGowan's book, Program to Kill, this had another social engineering effect of atomizing and traumatizing the nation just as much as if the events had actually happened in terms of seeing them, right? So seeing them on the news traumatized people. And so they even studied things like, Hitchcock films, Psycho, that traumatizes people as well, even though it's a fictional movie. Movies have been studied for their traumatization effects. And that fits perfectly in exactly what you said with their studies of future shock.
It's just great.
By the way, the idea of alienated youth, I forgot about this.
Yeah.
That was created and planned by Tavistock. So you'll notice that pop culture trends is a big part of what they're into, and studying how trends work, how they spread. Memes. If you remember a couple of years ago, it even came out that GCHQ, right, the British version of the NSA, have been doing years of research on memes, because memes is a huge part of social engineering and internet culture.
Right.
So people like Tim Leary, Gregory Bateson is a famous MK Ultra doctor. I mean, these are the real fathers of the hippie movement. They have connections to Laurel Canyon. They have connections to. Have you read Dave McGowan's book, by the way? Weird Things Inside the Canyon. Oh yeah, well, you're gonna love that, because it really gets into how the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement and the.
I have it written down. That's literally on my list. Yeah. Sorry,
how that was really used by and studied by Rand and Tavistock, so that they could be co-opted into ways to, in the future, change American society. So I'm not saying, by the way, that the Vietnam War, some people theorize that the Vietnam War was actually done to destroy the American mind. The war itself in Vietnam is a psyop on the American population. Right. As well as other psyops like using and testing drugs on Vietnam vets, this kind of stuff as well, which a lot of people know about. Agent Orange, this kind of stuff, right? Sure. So the drugs, the heroin. The Vietnam War itself was a U.S. war on the youth. It's a war on the youth of the U.S. via drugs, drug warfare. Sometimes referred to as, I think he says, the Guam Doctrine. And then that was all, of course, being studied by DARPA, being studied by Rand, being studied by the CIA. The notion of social justice warriors would actually come out of this older version of the alienated youth. And that was planned and created by Tavistock and Frankfurt School.
Which, Frankfurt School really ran with, and Tavistock used the psychological warfare.
One of those fake left gatekeepers, for example, of this new left was Noam Chomsky. And that's why, for example, you can ask Noam Chomsky about, the control of corporations, and he'll say all this correct stuff. But if you mention 9/11, he will shut you down and leave the room. Because he's a gatekeeper.
Right. I think it was Coleman who talked about the 3-system response. Are you familiar with that out of Tavistock?
Of what? What'd you say?
3-system response was superficiality, fragmentation, and then fantasy trip, which is the dissociation.
No, I don't know about that.
Okay. I feel like that is so integral to what we saw in 2020 with
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, because there's the first I mean, it's still just another iteration of the Hegelian dialectic. All of it really is, but which very much to me it seemed like every single tactic that Tavistock has studied and then sent out to its the seminaries seems to have come to a major culmination in this 2020 experience.
Well, one thing that also comes to mind, that although it may not be a direct creation of the Beatles' music, what the 60s counterculture did promote, that was a Tavistock idea, was giant open air festivals. So if you know about Altamont, right, the Rolling Stones had one of those where somebody got killed, by the way, and it's odd, by the way, that the Hells Angels are directly involved with that. If you've listened to my recent talks on serial killers, then you know that the Hells Angels comes up quite frequently. But open air festivals, which have now sort of morphed into raves and sort of open, big rave festivals, which, I guess after 2020, a lot of that got shut down. But there's pretty good evidence that, whether it's the Monterey Pop Festival or Altamont, that all kind of prepared for the club scene and all of that from the late 80s, early 90s, new wave and all that. Dave actually ends his book talking about, Sting and his connection to new wave music via his family's connection to the CIA, right? So Stuart Copeland, Miles Copeland being the famous CIA operative that wrote Game of Nations and multiple other CIA books as an operative for the CIA. Well, I forget if it's brothers or uncle to Stuart Copeland of the police. And so he set up CIA records, and I think they had a connection to the new wave movement, right, when the police were getting popular back in the early 80s, and you started getting this synth pop, British synth pop especially. So I'm just pointing out that a lot of people point out the connections of social engineering to the 60s counterculture movement. We've done a series with a couple buddies of mine on the punk movement being also having this social engineering CIA connection, Tavistock, Frankfurt School connection. And although I've not proven it yet, I'm pretty sure that it would be fairly easy to document that techno, electronica, dance, rave music, which I actually like, but strictly speaking,
and I actually like the 60s music, but
I like some 60s music too. But yeah, I mean, it also has that, that connection, I think, to social engineering for sure.
No, definitely.
If you look back at, think about the popular 2000s DJs. I mean, all the big global DJs, the whole thing that they were promoting was globalism. Every DJ's thing was global trance, global DJs, all global. And then when you go to the, the raves or the big dance parties or whatever, it's all about, it's a kind of initiation. Right? There's a lot of promotion of shamanic traditions. There's a lot of promotion of new age. There's a lot of promotion of, tantric yoga, all that kind of stuff. Totally. By design. It's not accidental.
Yeah. No, definitely by design. It is a little unfortunate when you start to learn about some of these things. It ruins the enjoyment. You recently did on Buffy. And that was actually one of my favorite shows. And I used to.
You can see these things for what they are and still,
totally. And still
you can separate, the good from the bad. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I used to joke that Buffy was the show like written for me, and that they were supposed to, even though that I didn't audition and like I hadn't even started my acting career yet, they should have come and found me because like clearly I was Buffy.
Right.
Right.
Well, what's interesting is that another way to tie that kind of stuff. I'm not saying Buffy was directly connected to Tavistock, but another way to tie that type of show and they'll do that kind of niche marketing. Like, okay, we need a show geared towards the high school girl. What do we want to engineer the high school girl to believe in 10, 20 years? And so I don't think it's accidental that you had such a heavy promotion of Wicca in that show. And then, nowadays I've done whole, mini documentary videos on how popular witchcraft is now, especially amongst millennials.
Totally. It does seem like and when you start to look at it, you can see that, it is a lot of these phenomenon that we're experiencing, the collective psychological phenomenons are by design. I used to observe, I guess, it seems like we have a rise of narcissism, of borderline personality,
Yeah, and there's actually Esalen mentions a desire to do that, to create more and more BPD manic people.
Yeah,
which is insane.
What?
So I think what they did was like a lot of that in culture research that they did on individuals, they just took that and they're doing it to the culture as a whole. That's really the value of all that.
The collective. Do you think that, so having studied some of the history of, or, what they said that Tavistock may be behind fomenting some of these major wars, at least the social engineering that was required in order for people to be
behind the war.
The acquiescence of the war, to support it. Do you think that there is that sentiment currently behind, I think there's a lot of talk about the tensions rising between China and Russia and, the global, obviously there's, the Middle East. Do you think that some of that, the social engineering is at play currently?
Yeah, one thing that's a classic kind of Tavistock move is it's all the way to the local news station itself is actually structured and set up in a really scientific way, even to the point of where and how the newscaster wears a tie. I'm not joking. Like, it's all set up in a very standardized scientific way. And that's why I'm sure you've all seen, the clip of the newscasters all repeating the same lines. Right. We've all seen that viral video, or actually several of those, whether it's like pictures of Dusty Boy in Syria that was intended to inflame the passions of people a few years ago in terms of the Syrian conflict, or, pictures of refugees walking down the road. Those are all used by the news media to stoke emotions, and emotional appeals. If you know about logic, for example, emotional appeals are a fallacy because they sort of bypass the reasoning process. Totally. And so they're very useful in psychological warfare, because if you're doing psychological, you don't want people thinking.
Right. You want them enacting their subconscious, not their conscious.
You want them to operate and react in an emotional way. And that way they bypass their reasoning, and because if they're reasoning, they're going to be thinking, well, no, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This is if we can think of the famous examples, like, they're throwing the babies out of the incubators, right? Which was Bush's PR term or firm actually got that woman to stage all that. Another example of this is Jerry Bruckheimer helped the Pentagon come up with a way, the famous movie director, helped Rumsfeld come up with a way to sell the idea of women in the military back in the late 90s and early 2000s through the whole Jessica Lynch story. So that whole thing that was all made up of this so-called woman hero, Jessica Lynch, that was all engineered by the Pentagon working with movie director Jerry Bruckheimer. So
wow,
these are classic examples.
Bless you. So Hollywood working with
also knew about using pop culture. I mean, that's another thing that the Frankfurt School and a lot of these psychoanalysts and psyops guys were studying, was using, as we said, TV. Both the medium and the message of TV itself is essentially a form of psychological warfare, because the TV itself, just in the way that the machine works, is it puts your brain into that more suggestible state. And then, by the way, I remember for a long time, Alex used to talk about the monkey labs, and you would see this in movies of monkeys strapped down watching the TV. And that's all true. I went and found, they've been doing that for decades, of putting monkeys in front of different types of screens, figuring out which screens actually induce the most, sort of brain zombie state in the monkeys.
And they did the what was the name of it? I'm gonna blank. The microwave experiments on the mind control, and I think Tavistock has used some of those studies as well for their social.
You talking about the microwave studies on apes or humans?
I believe it was on. That's a good question. I don't know. I think they did both, but I don't know.
Well, they made a stupid movie out of with Matthew Broderick called Project X. That's about the microwaving the monkeys. If I recall, it's been a while. I think I put that in one of my books, but I think it was based on a real program. But yeah, they've microwaved troops as well. So
it was, yeah, it was on, I'm sorry, it was humans. It was humans. And I think it was I don't know, it was one of the intelligence agencies that they did. I think it was CIA, but I don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I have to look back. Yeah.
Yeah, well, Esselin uses examples of how the TV turns people like Saddam Hussein, right? That it creates these villains. Because if you know the history, I mean, the CIA put Saddam Hussein in. They trained him. He used to be a CIA guy, and then they installed him. And then I guess he either, you know, his expiration date ran out or what, or he didn't do everything that the establishment wanted, and so the media turns on, right, and immediately he's a villain. So
they're useful until they're not. It's pretty much how that goes, it seems.
Estelin also mentions he talks about the way people view science, the promotion of scientism, dumbing down of the language. That was something that Orwell talks about, that H.G. Wells would talk about. H.G. Wells said that the ultimate revolution was the elimination of all languages in favor of some basic form of English with a very small number of words. So they want you to be dumb, basically. That's the point here.
I think we're seeing that. I think they've had some success.
Well, yeah, that's, you know, what's her name? Charlotte Iserbyt's whole book is Dumbing Down America. Yeah. And about how that plan was there back even in the 70s during the Cold War. They had already accepted the plan to have more of a social, that education is not education, it's socialization is what education actually is. There's a good book on that too called Messianic Character of American Education by R.J. Rushdoony, where he talks about how education was turned into kind of a just a tool for brainwashing, basically.
Oh, and I feel like we definitely see that. I'll have to add that to my ever-growing list. Thank you. I'm curious about, I had seen some in my research talks about how Tavistock was tied to Serco. This would be like the technological component of it. Serco is, you know, the company, the technology company. And through that, they're connected to Facebook, which wouldn't surprise me at all. But yeah, I don't know if you had any more.
Yeah, no, that I didn't know about. One thing that would back that up would be that so MK Ultra immediately transitions when they did the investigations. The government supposedly investigated it, and they supposedly shut it down. It just changed names and it moved to different places. And so it became MK Search, MK Delta, MK Naomi, and it was under the guise of biological warfare. And so Fort Detrick became a major place for that. And by the way, Fort Detrick was doing a lot of their experimentation in Australia and in Papua New Guinea. So they were actually studying Kuru disease, which is prion disease, which is mad cow disease, variants of that. So you might see how that could be relevant today. I won't go into that, but you probably know what I'm talking about.
Definitely relevant.
Yeah, so there's a direct connection between an MK Ultra project that was run by Fort Detrick under MK Naomi out of Australia and Papua New Guinea. That's something I just learned last night. I didn't even know that. But anyway, back to the point was that both John Markson and Walter Bowart at the end of their books talk about how, and they wrote that in the late 70s, that their books, that MK Ultra really just transitioned into studies about cybernetics, because they took all that brain implant electrodes in the brain, frequency ELF, VLF testing, and they just transitioned that over into biowarfare projects and made it biometrics, biomechanics, transhumanism. So literally MK Ultra is directly transitioning in the 70s and 80s and 90s into transhumanism via DARPA, via cybernetics. And so a bunch of the people who were Rockefeller funded MK Ultra people also started doing this biofeedback studies stuff, which was being done in Australia too, by the way, which becomes cybernetics at MIT. literally some of the same people. There's a long documentary that's about 3 hours that covers this called Minds of Men.
Oh,
and it talks about the transition from MK Ultra into transhumanism and cybernetics. And this is people like Norbert Wiener. And I think some of the people from Tavistock. It was funded by Macy Foundation, which also funded MK Ultra. And the way they funded MK Ultra was by giving money to people like Gordon Wasson to go and procure mushrooms. That was Macy money that allowed him to do that, as well as JP Morgan. So Gordon Wasson actually worked as a banker before he went and did all this MK Ultra stuff by procuring mushrooms in Latin and South America. And then Gregory Bateson, who was the CIA MK Ultra doctor and ex-husband of Margaret Mead, the anthropologist who, again, was also working in Australia.
Was also involved in Tavistock.
Yep. They're all connected to Tavistock, exactly. And that research, I forgot Dr. Jolene West, and I was talking about him the other night. Another one of these doctors connected to Tavistock, who's a CIA MK Ultra doctor. So this people would go directly into working at MIT in the group dynamics, group networks laboratory. And this is where we get Norbert Wiener and cybernetics.
Wow.
A lot of the RAND people too, because they were math people. Mm-hmm. John von Neumann.
Oh yes.
And so that they also were connected to the cybernetics people at MIT.
Yes. Von Neumann was a major player in DARPA as well. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's
one thing I want to say though is a lot of people get confused because they think, well, which of these groups is it? Who's running stuff? It's all
right.
Groups.
Yeah. No, they're all.
And a lot of the people in one group are in another group.
Yeah. No.
Don't get caught up in all the groups. They're all working for the same octopus.
Right. Right. They all answer to the same people.
Exactly.
For sure.
They do, literally.
I just think that it's very interesting how the reason I think Tavistock is such an integral component, though, is because the social engineering really has dominated, at least from my perspective, so much of the mind control that we're seeing today. And
well, if you wonder why half of the population are zombies, this is why.
Right. And I think that, some of the other, yes, as you said, they're all interconnected. So, without having these, government agencies that are obviously in all of the country, it's not just here, it's not just in the UK, it's, so many of them are interconnected. We're seeing the global web, if you will, for lack of a better way to word it. And, we know they all answer to the same people as well. But there's without the social engineering and the mind numbing, so much the people wouldn't acquiesce. And without the funding from these different groups, the banking entities and the banking arms of it, then the social engineering and the studies couldn't ensue. So they're all interwoven, but I really appreciate you making that point. I wanted to address you were talking about the studies in Australia. I find that really fascinating. I'm curious because when I was doing my research on, you brought up prions and, some of the, chemical experiments that are being implemented currently. A lot of the studies for that kind of laid the foundation, if you will, for what we have now, and those experiments that are being done on the human trials were done in Australia. And I'm curious why. I've also seen people talk about, it's on the World Economic Forum, they talk about like the smart cities, and Melbourne is one of them. And it's one of like the first one. And I'm kind of curious if you have if you know why. I don't know.
Could you repeat that? Why what exactly?
Why Australia? Why is Melbourne like the first of the smart cities that they do their testing grounds on? I just don't think these people are ever arbitrary or random.
It probably goes back to the fact that it's part of the Commonwealth. So, it's one of the Queen's dominions. So,
Yeah,
I mean, the fact that it's part of the British Empire, it would be the easiest answer to why that was such an easy place to do. Maybe the way that it's, it's its own little continent, makes it easier to do these kinds of experiments. I mean, they have Aboriginal populations that were experimented on actually as part of MK Ultra. In fact, some of the biofeedback experiments were done on Aborigines.
Oh, wow.
It's been a long time haven for pedophiles. It's a known pedo haven.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So there's a big study done by Joachim Hagopian. I don't know him. I've never met him. I've just read his stuff. And he pretty well sources what he talks about. And he has a whole thing on what's it called? I was just reading it.
Oh.
He wrote 3 books, but sometimes he puts the chapters of his book up. And so he's written a bunch of chapters on human trafficking, and his chapter is called Australia, where the global satanic pedophile network thrives like no other. Wow. So if you look up that, you'll find his blog, which is just different chapters of he's written 4 or 5 books on this topic. But anyway, so he had a bunch of stuff on that. And then I found another guy who had written a small thing, almost a little book on it. What's that guy's name? If you look up Steve McMurray, you can find his little book on CIA operations in Australia.
Okay.
And then, Yeah, I mean, I was thinking I'd actually it'd be cool to write a book on MK Ultra. I mean, I mentioned it in a few chapters in my book, but to really write a really hardcore book on that, because there's not really been a new updated one. A lot of the books that we have are pretty old.
I think you should, and definitely if you do, you should address that, because right now what they're setting it's not new, but they're really pushing a lot of this medicinal, like, microdosing and the ayahuasca. They're really trying to push this and promulgate it for under quote unquote healing purposes. So I think it would be really interesting for people to just understand the history of it and understand, some of the effects that have been studied behind it.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that there's so much, like you just always keep uncovering more and more information. Like, so I just found like all of these dozens of other MK Ultra doctors that I didn't know about. So, and then they've all got books. I mean, most of these people have books. Like you can go buy Jose Delgado's book, Physical Control of the Mind. You can buy Ewan Cameron's, published.
It'd be great to have a synthesis of them, which I think you're really good at doing.
Well, but what I'm saying is that there's so much material that it would almost be, I don't even know if you could read it all encapsulated. It'd
be a life project.
Half the MK Ultra stuff was destroyed, so we don't know what half of it was about. But anyway.
Yeah. Well,
I did just dig up one I'd never seen that was declassified, or it was a FOIA request.
Okay.
Which is pretty interesting about 1977 requests and looking into what the programs were. So I'm sure they're not extensive in terms of what the MK Ultra programs were, but it's just, I don't know what it's even titled, but you can look this up if you want to. It was linked in Wired magazine as one that was declassified. So, and it has amazing stuff in here.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, it's everything from electroshock to, LSD to figuring out how to give a chemical concussion was one thing they wanted to study.
Wow. Chemical concussions. The Cold War.
Yeah.
And Tavistock used a lot of these techniques.
Right. Well, remember, trauma, you could probably say trauma research is directly out of this. And one of the things that they wanted to create was drugs that would cause trauma. So rather than having to bop people over the head to create trauma, could we create a drug?
Or run around with electric shock machines?
A drug, could there be a drug-based technique to, quote, induce brain concussion without actual physical trauma? This involved human experimentation that was not justifiable on medical grounds. So here is a Department of Defense, a memorandum of the Secretary of Defense admitting that, yes, they were doing human experiments on trying to induce trauma.
Which I feel like we experienced the collective trauma. This is why people were so quick to acquiesce to all sorts of things that even 2 years ago, nobody would have accepted.
Exactly.
You know, if you said we're going to keep you locked up in your home for a full year, which they did in some places, that you're going to have to muzzle your face, you know.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't, you know, secret Tavistock studies done to get people to accept all that. I mean, we know there was Harvard studies, remember, on how to induce the population to go along with all the CUFIDs. Did you see that?
There were Harvard to go along with all the what?
CUFID.
CUFID? No.
That's what I call 2020.
Oh, okay.
Coofing.
Yes, I did see that.
It's a takeoff on the Coomer joke. Cooming.
Yes. Okay. I did see that. Yes, there were. And now seeing how many of the, not just think tanks, but the, Stanford Institute of Research, the Harvard, all of these Ivy League schools and their research offshoots of Tavistock. They're essentially, my dad wouldn't let me apply to an Ivy League school because he told me that he wanted me to get an education, not an indoctrination. I was actually not. Yeah. At the time, I don't know that I fully comprehended that, but in hindsight, I'm appreciative. And now, the more you know, yeah, you can't unsee what you've learned. So, yeah. So as I was reading about Tavistock, all of these, yeah, they're there, and as you said, it's right. They're all interconnected. So, but I think it's important for people to understand how they're connected and what each of these branches do, and how the impact that they have on you, because the reality is that we're all susceptible to the messaging we get, whether it be from Hollywood, whether it be from the media, or just from the culture itself. And the best way we can arm ourselves is to know that they're doing it. We can't always inoculate ourselves.
Well, I think the main thing is to understand that culture is created. Culture creation is more appropriate than that it's an organic thing. Some things are organic, sure. But most culture is created, and most of it is steered towards a desired end on the part of the power elite. Edward Bernays says that in the very first page of his book, Propaganda. Yep. So I think he would know. He says that you're all captive to a secret elite who control your desires and your thoughts. And they use psychological warfare, advertising, mainstream media, right? That's the point of Edward Bernays' book.
Right.
So basically, all these different groups are doing this: think tanks, academic institutes, study groups, research groups. They're just steering committees and planning groups and research groups for the global elite to create the global government. That's it. It's that simple.
That's simple. It's that frightening, but that's simple. And speaking of culture being created, so Tavistock, it looks like the early iteration of Tavistock, I think when it was still Tavistock Clinic, used all these writers who I really love, like Rudyard Kipling. One of my all-time favorite poems is If, since I was a little kid, by Rudyard Kipling. But they used writers, I guess, because they didn't have Hollywood too. So it's like H.G. Wells is, one of the very famous ones. And then, with the advent of, more of the Hollywood, they moved on to the Hollywood infiltration. They started with just taking writers and inculcating through their messaging. So.
The Esalen has a great chapter on science fiction too, right? So, H.G. Wells and all those guys played a key I mean, really science fiction was just ultimately propaganda to prepare us for technocracy. That's it. So they had to, since they had planned back in the teens and 20s and 30s, technocracy. Have you seen Lord Birkenhead's famous essay?
No, I'm familiar with them.
One of the Royal Society guys, Lord Birkenhead, wrote a Cosmopolitan magazine in 1919 or 1920.
Yes, okay. I've tried to find it. I read it years ago.
He talks about
currently.
Children being born in test tubes. Everything will be done through screens. I mean, it's way ahead of Brave New World. So Brave New World was 1932.
Right.
So, I mean, in other words, they had planned the technocracy that long ago, and they had to move people's thinking process into accepting technocracy. And the best way to do that is to sell it through decades and decades of science fiction. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever been to a stupid ass comic book convention, or all these generations of LARPing nerds are the perfect product of this very thing, of the think tanks. And not just the LARPing nerds, the millennial hipster. Those are Tavistock Frankfurt School creations. The alienated youth is itself a creation. And who loves science fiction more than the alienated youth? So really, science fiction was just a way to prepare us all for the illuminism of these groups.
Right. So I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. It was Birkenhead. Yes, I did read it. I read it back in high school, actually. But I recently tried to search for it, and I can't find a copy that's like, that you can actually read. If you have one.
It's hard to read. Yeah, you have to zoom in because it's just like a photo image on Google. Yeah.
This is my question, and we can really close out with this. Okay. So my final question would be, why do you think that because I feel like they do a lot of foreshadowing. And is it to lay the groundwork? Is it to prepare people? Because otherwise it would be too shocking for people to accept? Or like we were talking about the science fiction, right? The science fiction books, and so much of it was mapped out. I don't think they did it to be like, hey, we want to warn you. That would be nice. But
well, it's all the above. I mean, there might be some people who write things as a warning. Maybe some people wrote dystopia novels as a warning. And some people are doing it for conditioning, for preparation. Classic example of that is, Ian Fleming was putting the notion of Spectre into his novels as an international terrorist organization decades before the war on terror even existed. So I would venture that the British strategists and the Washington think tank elites, they also had already prepared for transitioning the Cold War into a war on terror, and that was planned long ago as well. So a lot of the times you'll see things rolling out in fiction to prepare the audiences for what will come right in the decades after that. So I think it's a conditioning exercise. It's a gaslighting exercise. It puts you into a future shock. Perhaps it might even shock you such that people in catatonic states are a lot more suggestible. They're a lot more malleable. That's again what the purpose of TV and TV signals is. So I think it's all the above. And yeah, some people are, artists who generally want to try to warn people.
Sure.
I think it's all that.
Combination. What do you think that people can do do you have any suggestions for what people can do to arm themselves against, I guess it would be called the long range penetration with interdirectional conditioning? That is the specialty of the Tavistock Institution of Human Relations.
Well, I think, so the first thing is realizing that this is what pop culture, mainstream culture, trends, etc., what they are is creations, and they're creations to control you. So that's the first thing, is to recognize that ideas are not just organically popping up everywhere and everything's just happening. No, things are controlled and things are steered. Not totally, but in a very large degree. So recognizing that is first and foremost. I mean, we've seen a tremendous amount of psychological warfare in the last 2 years, rolled out on the public, admittedly. Right. Harvard said they would use psychological warfare techniques to do what they've done in the last 2 years. So the first thing is being aware of that. And then the second thing is detaching and tuning out. So try to limit your exposure to pop culture. Obviously I watch a lot of movies. But, you have to draw lines. I'm not going to watch, Japanese torture porn movies or horror. I don't watch anything like that. Right. I've never found that kind of stuff appealing. So I try to not expose myself to degenerate music. That's another thing, is to not to step away from the pop culture. I think I said last time, the other things would be getting back to living in rural, outside of the city. That would be another good idea, to get back to eating normal foods, not this garbage food, not GMO food, but eating meat.
Right.
Largely meat.
That's what the Lewin paper was on. It was on
veganism.
Gearing people towards wheat instead of meat. Yeah. Bizarre. Sorry.
Yeah, that's an old elite plan. Exactly. Bertrand Russell talked about that. Plato talked about that a long time ago. But yeah, so that they don't want people eating meat, because meat is the food that is the most nutrient dense. So that's the best food for you. And so the elite would rather you be eating a bunch of genetically modified, sterile grains that are going to sterilize you. I mean, Bill Gates is now talking about seeds that will sterilize people and all that kind of stuff. So and then of course getting into Orthodox Christianity, I think, is something that's very beneficial. I've been, I've been a big promoter of that for the last 4 or 5 years.
Awesome. Well, do you have anything else you want to add? Yeah.
No, thank you. I mean, I'm not an expert on Tavistock. It's just something I've read a couple books on and come across in my research, and I know about how it ties into MKUltra, but there's certainly a lot more to do with MKUltra that I could probably speak to in a more educated way than Tavistock. But sounds like you know quite a bit about Tavistock as well. But if you haven't read yet, I would recommend Walter Bowart's book, Operation Mind Control, is really good.
Okay. Yeah, I'll definitely.
And he has a whole lengthy section about how it ties into cybernetics and MIT and transhumanism at the end of the book. And again, he wrote that in 1978, which is pretty amazing.
Wow.
Way ahead of his time.
That is amazing. Yeah. Well, if you ever want to come back and talk about MKUltra, I'm fascinated by that as well. And I know very little about it. So yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I can talk about that all day long.
Okay, awesome. Well, I will listen gladly, and I think lots of other people would be equally fascinated. So thank you so much.
I've got, by the way, the books that I just mentioned. I've got talks on all those books. So I've done talks on John Marx's book, which is an MKUltra classic. I've done a talk on Walter Bowart's book. Done talks on, just did one on my Rockfin on Kathy O'Brien's book, which I'm not saying that everybody who writes all these books is always correct. I can't verify a lot of the personal accounts of people that claim to be, this or that, but
that's why it's so important to read across domains, and then you can kind of make your own assessments based on.
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, I always say, I think it's really good to have these conversations as a launching pad for people. It's not to take, as face value or as the gospel. It's a launching pad for people to do their own inquiry and their own investigation. But, it creates hopefully that curiosity to do so. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah.
And
Dr. Colin Ross also probably has the most recent book that's a collection of all of the, he does an analysis of all the MKUltra doctors. It's called The CIA Doctors by Dr. Colin Ross. That's a pretty good book.
Okay. All right. Well, I have some reading to do, and I'll definitely send a link to, you can tell people where to find you now, and I'll post all the links for, everywhere they should find you.
Right. So, I'm on YouTube as Jay Dyer. I'm Jay Dyer on Rockfin, which is a great free speech platform. So I've got a lot of exclusive stuff on Rockfin. I have a website where all my archive content is, Jay's Analysis. And then, as you said, I host the 4th Hour of Alex about once a week or so, once every 2 weeks.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Until next time.